Okay, welcome everybody to the Innovation Policy Lab speaker series, Frontiers of Research in Global Innovation. The talk today is organized with our partners from the Big City, Big Idea lecture series. This is the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, the Martin Prosperity Institute, Global Cities Institute, School of Public Policy and Governance, Geography and Programming Planning, and Urban Strategies. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to say thank you to Essina Morla for organizing everything, and especially with what you're hearing around. Organization was well and beyond the regular event. Adam, Daria, and Margaret McCon from the Monk School, and Mary Castell and Christy Yun from Urban Strategies for all their media work for this event. Today's speaker is Professor Michael Stolper. Originally, we planned for President Gertler to do the introduction for Professor Stolper, and I think this is partly for him, not for us. Unfortunately, being the president, he had a scheduling conflict, but he would like to convey to Professor Stolper his wishes, best wishes, and to all of you in attendance. So, Michael Stolper is a professor of regional and international development and the director of the Global Public Affairs at UCLA Laskin School of Public Affairs. He holds concurrent appointments in Europe, where he's the professor of economic sociology at Sciences Po, and also the school of the LSE School in London, where he's a professor of economic geography. Michael is an internationally recognized scholar and author. He received the honorary doctorate from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands in 2008. He was elected to the British Academy in 2012 and also received the Regional Studies Association Award for Overall Achievement, the Sir Peter Hall Award in 2012 in the House of Commons. In 2014, he was named one of the world's most influential scientific minds by Thomson Reuters, which I think it's a great privilege for me to introduce you to Michael Stolper.
Thank you, Sherry, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here and for the warm welcome, generally. I'll try to talk loudly. Is that helpful if I talk sort of scream into the microphone? All right, so we'll do that. All right, so I want to talk about a book that's forthcoming from Stanford University Press. It'll be out in September, and it's co-authored with three of my former PhD students from a long research project that we undertook to examine the divergent economic development of California's two great metropolitan regions, the San Francisco Bay Area and Greater Los Angeles. That's its companion book, which is already out, which is my theory book. I'm doing a little advertising here. And the two are kind of a pair in the sense that this book sort of lays out a more general review of I would say urban and regional economic development, and the new book tries to execute it by studying two regions. So why look at just two regions, you might say? In urban studies, we usually use large samples. We study a lot of them to try and get general lessons. That's kind of what social scientists are taught to do, right? We're taught to get lessons that are supposedly very generalizable. And that gives us a general idea of how things are changing, but there is a trade-off to what we might call the depth of understanding. There's just so much you can do if you have hundreds of cities in a database, and you want to have any degrees of freedom with what you're trying to explain. Every social scientist knows this as a problem. So we thought that by looking at two city regions in great detail, we might be able to find things that are under the radar screen of very large sample studies of cities. I'm not advocating for one or the other. And in a way, I'd like to sort of suggest that this is something that complements what we know about cities in general, because when we look with a really sharp focus, we find levels of detail that aren't present in the large samples. But we compromised in this in that we organized our study of two cities by having it be very theoretically driven, meaning we organized it by saying, what are the questions that we know from studying hundreds of cities, and how can we train them onto two regions? And then we did a detective story. Basically, we said, we're going to try and test almost sort of all of the principal studies, all the principal ideas about what makes city economies move and change, and we're going to ask them systematically, but with a really in-depth look at just two big city regions. So it's sort of like a bridge between large scale and very sharply focused. So I don't know if those of you know, but this is the greater Los Angeles region. Actually, in the real study, we did commuting. And I can mention that a little later, but just to reassure you, we got the real commuting field. So this is LA on a nice clear day when there's no air pollution in the winter with our snow-capped mountains. This is, of course, our less beautiful LA, the image that the world loves of Los Angeles, traffic and smog. And this is, of course, another kind of typical LA image, palmy and balmy, what I would call it, right? That's Beverly Hills. Now, the Bay Area is actually, oh, there's an inaccurate. Oh, all right. Yeah. Oh, I didn't even know there was
Then
one.
they can get you on the mic.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, sorry about that. All right, so this is the Bay Area, which, as we defined it, had actually 10 counties, including Santa Cruz, which is here. More recently, actually, the U.S. government has redefined the Bay Area by adding the counties that are over here, because it's expanded and has commuters from basically Central California. But those are kind of, that's the ongoing expansion of regions over a 45-year period as we studied. San Francisco, of course, is famous for what we might call good geography. It's really pretty. Very cute, unlike LA. No one ever calls LA cute. But here's the real starting point for this study, and it's the hook. It's what got me into it and why I say there's a detective story here. So if you look at Los Angeles and San Francisco, these are the two broader metropolitan areas. One of them now has about 17.5 million people. The other has close to 8 million people. So these are very large regions. If you go back to 1970, they have per capita personal income that is within a statistical margin of error of one another, virtually very close to being identical or within a 5% variation. If you look to 2010, so that's 40 years later, there's about a 30% divergence between them. And that's the question that we wanted to investigate, which is how can two regions become so different in their levels of prosperity? Now, you can see that this is actually a somewhat broader phenomenon in that LA does rather poorly compared to a comparison group. Now, I took some very high income U.S. metropolitan areas, Chicago, New York, and especially San Francisco and Washington, which are very high income. But LA, you'll see it just kind of falls off. It falls out of what we might call this development club. Now, this is very striking, though, because in 1970, oops, I'm bad with the pointer, but anyway, you get the idea. In 1970, Los Angeles was ranked 4th in per capita income in the United States. You'll see that in 2009, it's ranked 25th. San Francisco, our comparison city, is number 1 and number 1. In the third column, what you see is the other variable that you always have to think about when examining comparative metropolitan performance, which is the incomes, per capita income, but how many people. So population change is widely varying across metropolitan areas. However, our two cities, San Francisco grew about 55%, and Los Angeles grew about 78%. So that makes them both both what we above average in terms of population growth for the United States, and contrast them to Frost Belt metropolitan areas like, say, Cleveland, which actually lost people. It's the number 9th there, or Detroit, which basically didn't change in population, or New York and Chicago, which did reasonably well in income, but didn't really bring in a lot new people. So what's nice about the comparison is that you have two metropolitan areas which are like vortexes pulling in lots of people, millions of people in fact, but one of them manages to do so while keeping the per capita personal income high, and the other brings in all these people with a slippage in per capita income. So it gives you kind of a nice problem to think about. What is it about incomes? We're not comparing, as it were, a city that takes in a lot of people to another city that doesn't take in a lot of people. Now, just to say, we did lots of things with these figures. I don't want to spend too much time on the technical stuff. We corrected the per capita personal income for cost of living. We did very detailed calculations which show that these differences are not due to differences in the cost of housing. And indeed, even though on average housing in the Bay Area is somewhat more expensive than Los Angeles, when you break it down into individual records of buying and renting, you find out that the differences virtually disappear. So these are real differences in real per capita personal income after taking into account the cost of living. That's number one. The differences also survive calculations of inequality. These two regions both have basically the same income distribution curves, meaning that they are two of the most unequal metropolitan areas in a relatively unequal country. They have Gini coefficients, for if that means something to people, of about 0.5, which make them quite unequal. But what it does mean is that at every point in the income distribution curve, from the lowest to the highest, people are earning more real income in the Bay Area than they are in Southern California. We adjusted them for who really commutes into the metropolitan area. So this is for real. And I say this because economic development officials in Southern California, whom we interviewed, were consistently very defensive at the beginning of the project when I presented these numbers. This is an interesting lesson. They said, that's not true. It's, the Bay Area is more expensive. The Bay Area is more unequal. You're not adjusting it for all of our, all the areas that are not really in this area, in the metropolitan area that you included. And we said, nope, we did all the calculations, and this is for real folks. So that's one thing when you do this kind of research, it becomes sort of controversial. Now, there are obvious starting points to explaining this. When you interview people, or anyone who knows anything about California will tell you this kind of story that's in this slide. The Bay Area, in this period, it wins Silicon Valley, which is the world center of the IT industry. It refocuses its old finance sector at the high end, meaning investment banking. And it gets a growth of IT-related new corporate headquarters, like all the household names that we, Google, Facebook, Apple, et cetera, et cetera. Southern California, in the meantime, it loses a lot of its aerospace and defense sector, which was a source of high-wage, high-skilled jobs. It loses corporate headquarters. It grows in low-wage, light manufacturing. The entertainment sector, which is a highway sector, grows, so that's a positive. It gains as the West Coast principal transportation and logistics center, meaning it's the biggest port on the west coast of North America and the biggest container port in North America. However, it's currently losing out in biotech. So those are the elements of sort of street folklore that everyone will tell you and that are basically all correct. However, there's a deeper story. And we can start with this, which is we can look at how are these two economies actually specialized, meaning what are the sectors or groups of sectors that they specialize in that are the products that they export to the rest of the world. And to some extent, it confirms the folklore, meaning that in 1970, you look at the IT sector. Now, what's interesting there is IT in Southern and Northern California in 1970 are about the same share of the regional economies, 2.6 and 2.7%. What stands out in Southern California in 1970 is aerospace and defense, the big previous high-tech sector. What stands out in the Bay Area besides IT is basically nothing. Now, you look down at 2010 at the bottom of the chart, and what you see is the spectacular four-fold increase in share in IT in the San Francisco Bay Area, and LA's basically stagnates as a share of the local economy. You see that aerospace and defense goes from 3.4 to less than 1%, so there's the collapse. You see as well that entertainment goes from being 0.7% of the Southern California economy to 2.5%, probably a positive. So that's a kind of a statistical confirmation, and these are based on really fine calculations. For those of you who are in the business of doing this kind of research, we added them up from what are called 6-digit NAICS sectors, being very careful about what's in them and therefore what's in our definitions. Now, so what one wants to do with this is say, what is it that might give rise to from the economic base, how would we get this divergence? And one way you can look at it is by looking at the kinds of jobs they generate, an obvious step that you do when you start this kind of analysis. And there you see in the red line Los Angeles, and in the blue line the Bay Area, and you see the wages, the average wage levels, and notably, what you see is that the Bay Area has a lot more high-wage employment than Southern California. Now, so wage data are a kind of, we might call them a prima facie evidence of the superiority of an industrial mix at some level. But actually, there's something more complicated going on that we discovered. So we have the sectors that are different, and we can say the Bay Area has more activity in sectors that, on average, have high wages. It turns out that something actually, I think, a bit more interesting is going on. So part of it is that San Francisco is composed of industries that, on average, pay higher wages. But we also discovered that when we look inside the different sectors that are present in both regions, that systematically, in the same sector, the Bay Area has activities, that is to say, occupations and functions that are remunerated much more highly than in Southern California. That's what we might call a within sector effect. And you can see this as an example. Take just the high-tech sector, defined at a very specific level, these 6-digit, what are called statistical categories, and you take occupations within the 6-digit sectors. So we're supposed to be zeroing in on things that are really not apples and oranges, but that are similar kinds of jobs in the two regions, and notice that there are absolutely enormous differences in wages. So what that suggests to a scholar is what we call unobserved heterogeneity, by which we mean they're really not doing the same things. And that's, by the way, something you would miss out if you were studying hundreds of cities in a database. You wouldn't be able to drill down to this level of detail. And it's a general lesson, by the way, for the field of studying economic development, which is oftentimes when we use statistics at rather aggregated levels, we overstate the similarity between economies. When you drill down to what people are actually doing, you find that they're a lot more different than we think they are. And we oftentimes inappropriately say, well, in the IT sector, for example, but the IT sector is a big mix of different things going on, and that's what we discovered. So Southern California and Northern California both have a lot of IT. They just don't do the same things, even within very, very disaggregated statistical categories. Now, and you can see, so again, you look at different occupations. So computer software developers, look at how they just come apart somewhere after 1980. Something makes the software people in the Bay Area start to earn a lot more money than the software people in Southern California. Now, there's another way that you can look at this to confirm this, which is we now have data that take occupations across industries and they're based on databases that were developed by people at MIT like David Autor, some of you may know that name, and Frank Levy. And what they do is they measure the task content of professions and whole industries, of occupations and industries. And they tell you whether the kind of work being done is routine or non-routine, so whether it's embodied in protocols and rules or whether it depends on the individual's decision-making, and whether it's manual or cognitive. So you get kind of a four-way classification. And what you can do is characterize work by its level of sophistication, and that should correspond to levels of wages. And what we find is that there are radically different, what we might call levels of non-routineness and cognitive sophistication in the overall mix of jobs being done in the two metropolitan areas. So there's a bunch of lines on this chart. First of all, look at the blue, look at the blue line here. So that expresses the means of, and the index on the left is it's a span of possibilities for non-routineness and more sophistication as you go up the vertical axis. So notice that what happens is that that Los Angeles is the lowest in 2010 is much lower than both the Bay Area and the United States, which is in green here. Trying to read my own slides here. Yeah. Okay, it's in the middle, right. So LA is somewhere below the US, and of course, the Bay Area, which is the red line up at the top, you can see the gap between, and this is all of the jobs in the two regional economies, and taking the sort of average of sophistication, that is cognitiveness and non-routineness, you can see that they split apart over this period once again. Now, the other thing that we did is we took the two regions and we said, what would the level of sophistication of work be if every industry in these regions had the US average of sophistication of work in that industry? So what we tried to do is correct for a US baseline. And what you see is the Bay Area, if it had the US task means would be there, trying to get it right, would be there. But the Bay Area is in fact above that. So what it's showing is two things. It's showing that not only does the Bay Area have a pretty good mix of industries, even if its work was just like that of the US as a whole in those industries that it has, but that in addition there's a regional effect, meaning that the things that the Bay Area does within its industries are more sophisticated than what its industries do in the national economy as a whole. And the reverse holds for Los Angeles. Los Angeles is below the average on the yellow line for where it would be if it's the firms in those industries that it has were performing as those industries do on average in the American economy, it would be higher than it is. So again, two things are going on here, and this is very important to the overall story. It's what industries you have and what you do in them. And the Bay Area has, in other words, a mixture effect or a composition effect, and it has a regional effect. All right, so now that's just a way of saying that's a description of the story. We can confirm that these economies really sharply diverged in what they have, what they do, and how they do it. Now, the big question for our book is why? And you could phrase that as what changed their specializations. Okay, and this is in a way the holy grail, in my view, this is the holy grail of economic development analysis. You want to know why economies change toward doing one thing or another over some medium range of time. And there's a bunch of different explanations out there. So the standard ones, you might say, is one could be good luck versus bad luck, or what economists would call all external shocks. Stuff just happens to economies. You win, there's technological change, and sectors reorganize, and they change their locations, and economies get shocked. And a lot of even very good economics literature, what it does is it brackets all that stuff. It says there's a shock, and we'll model what happens to the economy as it moves back to its so-called long-run equilibrium after the shock. So one thing we might want to consider is how much of this was really due to just good luck and bad luck or shocks. Another is, of course, a more what we might call endogenous explanation of change, which is it's mostly about the factor endowments. And in the case of economic development, capital really isn't a big problem in a developed country. The real issue would be the endowment of labor, people, and their skills. And another one that in economic development we think a lot about is what we might call is the endowments of entrepreneurs. So that's how economists might phrase it. So that's kind of what you have versus what happens to you. Now, we actually, I said we developed this research project on this book as a kind of detective story. We thought we're going to consider as many of the standard explanations as we can and see where we come out at the end. We had an open mind about this question of income divergence. I was really very curious and had no idea what the answer would be. In the end, I'll tell you the purpose of this talk and where I'm going to end up is this, which is we're going to end up with a third kind of explanation. And it's about institutions, meaning, or what we call in the book, the relational infrastructure of these two regions. We discovered that in the two regions, there were different kinds of networks of entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders, that they were very different. They led to a different, what we might call, transposition of existing skills into new forms of capitalism, and led them to be differently successful in going from the old to the new economy. So the Bay Area became essentially an inventor of the organizational practices that are at the core of the new economy, and Greater LA stuck to much more traditional forms of enterprise and organization in spite of its excellent initial endowments. So that's going to be the story I'm going to tell. Now, so let's just sort of consider each of those three so I'll try to argue for my point of view. Good luck and bad luck. There are lots of good luck myths for San Francisco and bad luck myths for LA, right? So San Francisco, the good luck myths are that the inventor of the semiconductor, William Shockley, he moves from New Jersey to Menlo Park, which is in Silicon Valley, to be near his aging mother. And of course, what happens is there's a famous thing in the folklore about Silicon Valley, which is that Shockley was a pretty aggressive guy, and he brought 8 of the best technologists in the country with him at that time, but that they all left because he was rude to them publicly. And they all started up the startup or spin-off economy of Silicon Valley, and that led from one thing to another. So that would be kind of it's like a one-off explanation or a luck explanation. The other would be that Fairchild, a semiconductor, made a breakthrough chip, which is true. That they just somehow were the first to get a really powerful, cheap, commercializable chip to the market. So that's the luck story. LA's bad luck would be the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War, but remember the end of the Cold War comes late. Cold War only ended in around 1991. But the story that's often told is that if we'd kept the Cold War, LA would have had this great defense economy and kept on building missiles and airplanes and all that stuff and stayed rich. Now, remember, so LA's slide becomes well before the end of the Cold War. Indeed, LA's slide in incomes comes right in the middle of the huge Reagan aerospace buildup of the 1980s. LA is given a jolt of incredible funding from Reagan, and yet its per capita income is slipping. The other thing is that when you actually calculate both the direct employment losses and the multiplier effect losses of the aerospace build-down very precisely, what you find is that exactly 2.37% of the per capita income gap between it and San Francisco is due to that build-down. And I'm talking about direct and indirect employment effects in the economy, which we have in the book, and whereas the actual gap that opens up is about 30%. So you can't build, as in Southern California, everyone says, oh yeah, it wasn't our fault, it was all because of aerospace. It's not true, at least from our our calculations. Another thing you could say is that Fairchild's chip really wasn't very revolutionary. What was revolutionary was because there were chip makers in Southern California that had chips that were similar to Fairchild's, only they never marketed them because they never thought there was any money in it. So we will see, and I'll show you in a minute, from IT and the recent biotech cases, that it was the orientation of business, not so much innovation itself, that caused the regions to diverge. Labor endowments. Now, this is a really big one because it's the core of what urban and regional economics says today about why urban economies develop. And the story that you get out of urban economics today is basically a supply-driven explanation, meaning the regions that have better labor supplies are going to attract or create better forms of economic activity. So essentially, if you have more college-educated people, you're going to get ahead of other regions. And by contrast, if you bring in a lot of less skilled, less educated immigrants, you're going to slide down the ranks of regions. This is, if you look at the vast majority of good work in sort of technical urban and regional economics, this is what you will find as the core story. Now, and you can find various things like the Glazer Skilled City or the Richard Florida Creative City. They're all variants of this story. They're supply-driven, labor supply-driven explanations of urban and regional development. Now, however, and this was, again, the point of drilling very deep into two regions, when we looked at the statistics on labor, we found that the explanation, the supply-driven explanation, doesn't hold up to close scrutiny. So let me show you what we mean. So now look at what happens when you look at different kinds of labor supply. Here we are controlling for the key variable, which is education/skill. And notice that it mirrors very much the overall situation of per capita income. College graduates independently of whether there are more college graduates in the Bay Area than in LA, there are, by the way, that a given college graduate sees a huge gap open up in their income over the period under examination. Same thing happens if you look at immigrants. So these two regions have somewhat different immigration streams. There are more, to put it bluntly, highly skilled Asians in the mix of immigrants going to the Bay Area and more lesser skilled Latinos going to Southern California. But when you start to look inside the immigrant populations, the wages just come apart, even within immigrant groups. So that's non-natives. But that's, for example, the highly skilled immigrants. Take a college-educated Latino or Asian, put them in San Francisco, they're going to earn more money than they will in LA. So again, driving the difference of the explanation of divergence on the characteristics of workers can get you only part of the way. Here we show, indeed, that if you look at the very lowest skilled immigrants, so these are the Hispanic immigrant workers who are, on average, the lowest skilled immigrants in both regions, what you find is that from almost identical wages in 1970, about a 25% gap opens up once again in 2000, in the latest period that we get, 2005 to 10. We did rolling averages. So you can decompose it this way. You take recent immigrants, that is, who are there less than 5 years, you decompose them by what level of education they have, and bingo, except for the very, very lowest skill of those that have less than high school, you get, once again, very big differences opening up in the fate of these homogeneous people between two regions. So to sort of do it anecdotally, you could say, take any category you want in the labor market. Take a 30-year-old male, recently immigrated from Mexico, who has a high school education. You put him in LA versus San Francisco. He will have higher wages in San Francisco. And add all that back up to the labor market, it means you cannot drive the explanation of divergence on merely the different composition of the labor supply. It has to be something about what happens to people once they get to the regions. And that's something that most of urban labor economics can't deal with, by the way. You cannot find this sort of heterogeneity within categories that is a pure regional effect, except when it's assigned to the cost of living. But that didn't hold up in our two regions, as I showed earlier. So there's something like a 5% average skill gap in 1970, but it grows. The wage gap increases. Basically, the wage gap increases a lot more than the growth in the average skill gap. And that's the real story there. So then some people say, well, okay, take another part of the urban economics literature. And remember, I said it was kind of like a detective story. We thought we'd give credence to every possible hypothesis that you could find out there from the crowd of people who explain divergence. And we said, okay, well, they're going to tell us it's about migration, that something about migration is attracting the higher skills to San Francisco, and that's partially true, and something is pushing them away from LA. But urban and regional economics tells you something. It says where there are big wage gaps, there will be migration. So now remember, and a lot of people say, well, yeah, but it's because LA is closer to the Mexican border, so they get more low-skilled Latinos than San Francisco. But that's kind of weird when you think about the fact that there are now Latinos all over the United States. There's a huge Latino population in North Carolina, in Chicago, in New York. I mean, these are Mexican populations. So LA is no longer an exclusive gateway city. And remember, there's only 340 miles between Los Angeles and San Francisco. So if you're, as the migration literature says, a rational person, rational enough to have gotten all the way across with great obstacles from Mexico or Central America, and you're not going to go another 340 miles when your relatives are saying, yeah, I'm earning a lot more up here. So what's going on there? Something about that explanation is not an explanation at all. And of course, we'll see why that's the case. So so that was kind of a way that we went through all of the standard urban and regional economics literatures, and we tested them in great detail. We put it under a very fine microscope, and we said, we do not have an explanation here. What we have are descriptions. I think that's another general lesson that we argue for in the book, is that a lot of what passes for so-called explanation isn't actually telling you about sequences of causality at all. It's just describing differences between economy. It's not a very good stand-in. It doesn't really give us deep understanding of change. So then we turned in this project to looking at detailed histories of the evolution of the key industries in the two regions. And it kind of brought me back to my roots because, I was trained as an economic geographer, and we always did that kind of stuff on the ground, but we get intimidated by economists who have fancy models of labor supply and shocks and all this stuff. And so having done that, we said, okay, we're going to go back to the original stuff and look at stories of how the industries actually adjusted. And we did comparative studies of aerospace, information technology, entertainment, finance, logistics, and biotech. And what we found was strongly diverging ways that firms, business leaders, leadership groups, and public agencies used their technology factor endowments in creating the practices of the new economy. So we decided to see if after we did these 5 case studies, and we assembled them, and we said, okay, these are really different stories. For each sector, there's just different stuff that happens in the two regions. And we said, let's go back then to a general kind of level of the two regions and see if we can measure systematic differences in the institutional makeup of these two regions that might have led these industries to develop so differently. So we went back to a general level. And now, institutions and practices, it's a hard one to get your head around, much less to measure as a scholar. And it means a lot of different things. It's hard to measure because of the breadth and difficulty of obtaining good data on institutions. But we could say, in a more simple kind of way, that there's 2 kinds of institutions. One is formal, meaning you've got local and regional government and their economic development policies, and you've got public expenditure priorities, and you've got what we might call policy preferences. Those are things that you can actually look at and say, Did these things differ enough to explain the radical income divergence between the two regions? And then you can look at something that's even a little bit more woolly, which is informal institutions. So informal institutions are things like what Douglas North called the beliefs and attitudes of leaders. How do beliefs, what do we think about the economy, and does it cause us to act differently? What about informal networks among key agents in the economy and between entrepreneurs and technologists and business people? It's kind of a big theme, by the way, in economic sociology. It's a specialty of economic sociology to look at these networks or invisible colleges in economy. So we said we're going to get into that and see if we can see systematic differences between the two regions. So what did we do? When we started with the formal institutional outputs, and we looked at economic development policy. And first of all, in the United States at least, there are virtually no reliable published databases on what local and regional governments do in the area of economic development. We don't know who does what, and we don't know what they spend on it. We don't have standardized categories for reporting what local and regional governments do, even though hundreds of billions of dollars are spent, tens of billions of dollars are spent every year on these kinds of policies, although even there we don't have accurate estimates. So what we did is we said, there we go. The advantage of just having two regions, even though there are vast regions with hundreds of cities in them and dozens of special authorities. So we said we're going to go and reconstruct what they did. And we took a wide variety of sources. So we took infrastructure policy, tax policy, business regulation policy, housing supply and regulation policy in the two regions on the part of all of their public jurisdictions. We coded them, and we put them into a database, and we tried to see if there were systematic differences between the two regions. And to make a long story short, we could find no significant differences between the Bay Area and Southern California in what they basically tried to do to promote economic development. Okay? Now, there's an open question about what we might have missed, and that's because local and regional governments, at least in America, they probably understate and overstate what they do in the name of economic development. They overstate because they want to sell things and say, you know, everything we did was to create jobs when it really has to do with some other political priority. And then they sometimes understate because they just don't have accurate or standard practices for labeling things. By the way, it was a real nightmare to do this kind of work. So first hypothesis, and by the way, one of the myths is that the Bay Area is more restrictive on constructing housing because it's supposedly more environmentalist than Southern California, and therefore that drives up the price of housing, and therefore that restricts the labor supply to more highly skilled people, and therefore that drives up per capita incomes more in the Bay Area than in LA. That's a standard hypothesis, by the way, from the real estate economics and economic development literature. It's completely false. Southern California has more highly regulated housing markets than Northern California, contrary to the Bay Area's environmentalist reputation, but they basically both tracked each other in issuing housing permits and type of housing mix expansion, and so it could not possibly have had any selective effect on their labor supply. So one of the big myths goes away. There's zillions of articles claiming that I think mismeasured it. So we said, okay, we've gone through some of the hard stuff. What about the more sort of woolly, informal institutions? And we started with Douglas North's idea about beliefs and economic development, right? He thinks that beliefs have a recursive relationship to economic development because they orient what different kinds of leadership groups think they should do, or they orient their models of the future. And that seemed like something really plausible to us. So what we did is we said, let's try and test it empirically. And we took 30 years of reports by the major regional business roundtables and networking forums. So ABAG means the Association of Bay Area Governments. SCAG is the Southern California Association of Governments. Those are public talk shops of the local governments that they're required to be members of, and they issue reports and forecasts. And they're kind of like, you can take them, their narratives, as sort of like empirical evidence of what the regional leaders were believing in at the time. We did that. And then we took things like private industry leadership groups. The Bay Area Council is the principal networking forum for major corporations in the Bay Area. LA Business Roundtable, LA Chamber of Commerce, LA Economic Development Forum are the big ones in Southern California. And we also took their reports and we said, well, just what are their narratives? Sort of like a literature scholar. And we did content analysis on them, very simply. This is just like raw material. And what we found is that in Southern California, you hardly ever find a mention, hardly ever find the term new economy in these reports, both private and public. Whereas the Bay Area is centrally concerned with it, and from about 1979 onward. So the Bay Area becomes obsessed with the notion that they are in the new economy. LA, by contrast, has its policy attention and its narrative attention is crowded out by crisis. Southern California is having problems already from the 1980s onward. So they have a loss of manufacturing, which is very dramatic in the 1970s and 1980s. And they start to have these massive waves of immigration and also repetitive civil unrest from the 1980s onward. Aerospace conversion in the middle of this gets scant attention in the narratives of the leadership groups. Here and there you'll find a little mention, but never anything big like we really have to do something about this. Instead, what happens is leaders are concerned with dealing with social and economic crisis, and they turn to what we might call low-hanging fruit, which is, we've got a port. What if we improved it? And so they undertake a very important port improvement program involving not only deepening and widening the port docks, but also building a dedicated rail link between the ports and downtown Los Angeles where you can get goods from China in an automated way into all of continental North America. And they succeed in that. But no talk about new economy. It's all about, if there is any talk about globalism in Southern California, it's, oh yeah, we have a port, we're an international gateway. Of course, a port industry, though, is a low and medium wage industry. And that's where they succeed. They score on that one, but they don't pay attention to anything else. The Bay Area, on the other hand, consistently ramps up its attention with more and more sophisticated studies, notably through a private industry organization called the Bay Area Council Economic Forum, which hires in very good professionals and most importantly, analyzes the new economy correctly and gets really big attention, not only from the old downtown San Francisco elite, but from the new Silicon Valley elite, which joins in. Okay, so then that's sort of on the narrative. You might say, well, okay, but that's just talking. Is there anything that you can support those kind of views with that's harder? And here we took inspiration from the economic sociologists who measure network structures of control in the economy. And notably, there's a big literature in sociology that measures how corporations and organizations relate to each other through basically board of director cross-membership. And it's a big thing. There's all kinds of softwares for doing it now in sociology and economics, and it's kind of fashionable to do it. And so we decided that we would try to do this for the corporate and leadership structures of these two big regions. There is one book out there by Sean Stafford that did it for Allentown and Youngstown, two smaller cities in the US, but no one has ever done it at the scale of these very big metropolitan regions. So we looked at the corporate board interlocks, meaning who belongs to who else's board of directors. And we did it in two ways. One is we did it within industrial sectors. So, which IT companies are related to other IT companies, but also we measured it in terms of the across industry links. So how many IT firms are, for example, related to aerospace firms? And we tortured the data in every way that we could. And what we found is that the network structures of principal corporations in the two regions are very similar. And 1980 was the earliest data we could get. By 2010, they are radically different. The Bay Area has substantially higher ties both within industries and across them. So the Bay Area has more ties. Not only, you would expect it to have more ties because it's more concentrated it has one big industry, which is IT. So it's a one-horse town now, and you'd expect within a part of the economy that IT people would sit on each other's boards. But actually it turns out that the Bay Area is not just like another one of those effects of what composition I have. It's also, there's a pure regional behavioral effect, because corporate people in different industries sit much more on each other's boards in the Bay Area than they do in LA. So LA has become a more organizationally fragmented economy. The Bay Area has become a more networked economy, and the numbers show it very clearly. Now, we don't know exactly, again, is it an outcome or a cause? It's not just, again, like I said a minute ago, because of IT, because the effect shows up within IT and between IT and all other sectors. So, that's the numbers, which I won't bore you with, but there's a lot of them in the book. Buy the book in September, and you'll see all of this as proof, I guarantee you. All right, so there's other kinds of networks you can think about. Now we're moving into kind of standard stuff in the regional literature. So innovation networks. We all know that patenting and scientific innovation are very important, as are commercialization. Per capita patenting takes off in the Bay Area in the 1990s. It's probably an outcome of the IT revolution and the growth of Silicon Valley, not an original cause. LA is just as high on patenting at a per capita level in the 1970s and 1980s as is the Bay Area. But there's a crucial difference. As it turns out, the innovators in the Bay Area, they cite each other much more than in Los Angeles. So when you do a patent application, you have to cite the other patents that might be related. And it's kind of like a paper trail of whose knowledge went into your patent. And it turns out that patenting or knowledge sharing, at least by this paper trail, is much more regional in the Bay Area than it is in Southern California. This is what we call the net local citation percentage. It's a technical term. The other thing that you find out is that university patenters in the Bay Area are much more, actually 7 times more on a per capita basis, tied into local firm formation than in Southern California, even when you control for the patenting level and the field of patenting. That is within each area, so we're not comparing, again, apples and oranges. Most notably, there's an enormous difference between Caltech on the one hand and UCSF and Stanford in how much they patent, how much their patents draw on regional knowledge, and how many times they're cited by regional patenters. So another clue there about regionalness. What about entrepreneurialism? It's a really hard thing to measure. There's a huge literature on it. One thing we can say is that these are, if you want to look at aggregate entrepreneurialism, they both start up firms at the same level. They basically turn them over at the same level. So that's not going to get you anywhere in looking at divergence. But the networks of entrepreneurs are totally different. When you look at the networks of entrepreneurs in the specialized industries of the two regions, so that means Hollywood and IT, basically. So entertainment and information technology. What you find is that in the Bay Area, if you look at the high tech, well, actually it's IT plus biotech, that the rate of an entrepreneur who started up a new firm, having worked with another entrepreneur as a co-manager, or of a scientist having worked with an entrepreneur, that it is 9 times more likely to happen in the Bay Area than it is in greater Los Angeles. So you could say that the Bay Area has these dense, invisible colleges of scientists and entrepreneurs who have at one point in their life worked together, either in starting up a firm or in co-managing a firm, than in Southern California. And so this combines with the statistical evidence on the greater range of cross-industry ties and cross-firm ties in the Bay Area, and these gaps open up along with the income divergence. I can't tell you causality, but I can tell you that they're co-emerging. Okay, so that gives you, I think, a story that we're looking at very different regions, or regions that become very different over time. Now, we might say, I've been telling you a catastrophe story for Southern California. There is, of course, the big success story, and it's an unqualified success. It's Hollywood, meaning the entertainment industries in Southern California. I've been studying them since the 1980s. It is a very vibrant industrial agglomeration. It's a bigger share of Southern California now than back then, and Southern California has a bigger share of Hollywood, of the entertainment industries, than it had in the 1970s and 1980s. It's strengthened its national position without a doubt. And Hollywood is new economy. It's real new economy. It's highly networked. It's highly fragmented. It has all of the characteristics of an extremely flexible kind of structured industrial agglomeration. But Hollywood is 2.5% of employment in the greater LA region, whereas IT is about 11% of the Bay Area. So it can't carry the whole region. As luck would happen, San Francisco's new economy industry is just 4 times, proportionally speaking, more than 4 times bigger than LA's. And this is LA's only real high-wage card to play. The other problem is, of course, that Hollywood doesn't seem to have had any kind of spillover or demonstration effect for the Southern California economy as a whole. And this, of course, because it's not science and technology based, it's content and sort of artistically based, as it were. It has a lot of technology in it, but it's not made up of geeks. It's made up of art types. And art types don't talk to engineers, at least in Southern California. Moreover, we interviewed some of the elite of the Hollywood industry, and they pretty much said, they told us, we said, well, aren't you interested in the LA economy and playing part in the regional business leadership and all that? And the answer was basically, no, I know like where the studio is, where my office is, where I live, and I know where LAX is so I can get to Manhattan, right, where my other apartment is. So they really, I have some great quotes on this, by the way. But the point is that unlike the Bay Area, where it appears that in a networking way, the IT industry becomes the zeitgeist for the entire business environment of the Bay Area. It's kind of like everywhere in the air. It's infusing all of the networks. In LA, you have this fabulously successful industry, but it's, as it were, in a bubble from the rest of the economy. Now, there's a couple of just last pieces of evidence, and then I'm going to draw it all together. We looked at civic networks. We thought, well, we're being too narrow in looking just at business leadership. What about is there something that's going on that's sort of beneath this, what seems to be very different relational structure of the two regions? And so, we tried, like good social scientists, to say any shred of evidence that can help us see what's going on. So we, for example, looked at density of things like private foundations, civic organizations, unions, and other things that might be part of the civic or relational leadership. And what we find is that on a per capita basis, the assets of these organizations are about 2 times greater in the Bay Area than LA, and 2 times greater in aggregate sense, and 4 times on a per capita basis. So you've just got a bigger sort of supportive civic infrastructure in the Bay Area than you do in Southern California. People have made a big deal in recent years out of sort of civic mobilization in Southern California, which is all true, by the way. There's a very vibrant community and union movement, but it has such a huge gap to go to the Bay Area that it has not even come close to catching up. Social capital indexes, we tweaked some data to get indices of generalized social trust between citizens, and just like the popular image of Southern California, it turns out that there's a small gap in LA and San Francisco in 1970, and a huge gap today, that somehow the LA has become, as it were, a kind of more alienated place compared to the Bay Area over this period, at least if one believes these data. So it seems like, you say, well, why might this matter? Well, because obviously over the period of time that we're examining, Greater LA and the Bay Area, they both faced a lot of challenges. LA especially, deep recession in the 80s, end of the Cold War, the Rodney King riots over police violence, loss of confidence in itself, a rise in low-skill, low-wage population. And when you look at what happened faced with these challenges, we reconstructed the history of community, labor, and governmental coalitions to try and address these problems. And what you find is an absolutely crushing history of failure and abandonment. A former city council member who is also a trained city planner said, "The landscape of Los Angeles is littered with the carcasses of coalitions to deal with our economic development processes." Michael Wu, some of you may know him. So they just kind of faded away. So the point is that the Bay Area is really a very different story. And it's not a story of, so there's really nothing exceptional. If you go back to 1970, there's nothing exceptional about the Bay Area engineering culture. LA County had probably the most astonishing engineering culture in the United States in 1970, with this enormous aerospace industry and an incredible multi-decade history of inventiveness, tinkering, innovativeness, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. And indeed, Silicon Valley started going down the road of a normal product cycle as early as the 1970s. It was already losing semiconductor fabrication plants to other regions of California and to the US in the 70s when we were students at Berkeley studying it. What emerged, however, as exceptional was something that permitted Silicon Valley to not just stop there with the sort of going down the normal product cycle, and to keep regenerating its innovative capacity. And here I think is the untold or the lesser explored history of what really was different about the Bay Area. And I'll sort of throw it out there. It's not an entirely original hypothesis. It's one that I got onto from two sources. So one source I'll announce up front is an anthropologist who works at Stanford University called Frederick Turner, and he wrote a great book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And the other was when I went on YouTube and listened to Steve Jobs' 2005 commencement address at Stanford University, in the last minute of which Steve Jobs says, "The thing that was really exceptional when I got started in doing technology in the Bay Area was that we had this Bible, all of us, and this Bible was called the Whole Earth Catalog." The Whole Earth Catalog was a large format magazine that was published by what was called the alternative technology movement, alternative technology / environmentalist movement, appropriate technology, movement in the Bay Area. And it was a Bible about useful, simple, pleasurable technologies that were supposed to make daily life better. And so Steve Jobs says that, and I thought, okay, well, is he just bragging to make himself seem like a hip and cool guy? Because that's what people do in self-representation. So we followed up on those clues, and we went and interviewed several people who had worked at a research organization around that time called Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC meaning Palo Alto Research Center. So Xerox PARC was a kind of a freewheeling early research center in the IT industry, having been started up by the photocopier company that was based on the East Coast. But they started up this freewheeling research center, and we went and interviewed several of the people who had worked there. And we got a consistent picture from the interviews that backs up what Steve Jobs says in his commencement address. Everyone talked about how it brought in a bunch of the conventional engineers, notably from the Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild, Shockley crowd, who were what we might call kind of buzz-cut engineering types, real straight, a lot of them having come out of the Cold War and the defense industries, very much taught to be engineering types. But it turns out that Xerox PARC had a lot of what they called long-haired hippie types from Berkeley, notably faculty from Berkeley, who were involved directly working alongside them. And the interviews show very clearly that it turns out to have been a crucial place where two kinds of Bay Area social networks met up. One was the engineering networks of the Bay Area, but the other was we might call it the kind of environmentalist, socially progressive, but scientifically and futuristically organized parts of the Bay Area scientific and civic elite. And of course, this is what Woody Powell and other sociologists would call material for exactly what I think happened. That is, two different kinds of worlds meet through something that makes the social networks cross and transfer skills back and forth between them. The engineers get exposure to a whole culture of user-friendliness, social utility, application, or what Steve Jobs would have called beauty and simplicity. The appropriate technologists get exposure to technology, and the milieus come together. That never happens in Southern California. It has a gigantic technological milieu that essentially stayed within its corporate/military culture and never got these alternative influences that would have pushed it toward commercialization. So LA had the endowments. It got lazy about commercialization because of the luxury defense market. Now, this is kind of what I just told you. Now, I want to tell you one last story. I've talked too long, but here's the last story which sort of confirms the IT divergence. And it's a more recent one, but it shows exactly how these different network infrastructures work, and it's biotechnology. The science for gene splicing is developed simultaneously and in cooperation between University of California at San Francisco and the City of Hope Hospital in downtown Hollywood. Herbert Boyer, he attempted to do his first startup in Los Angeles, and among the first startups that he was involved in was the firm that would become Amgen. And Amgen's board of directors is shared between scientists coming from Caltech in Pasadena, UCLA, and the University of California at Santa Barbara. So even though Boyer is from San Francisco, he goes down with City of Hope people, says, let's start this firm up and let's put the scientists on it from these three universities. Amgen very quickly became a successful firm, and the scientists, but as soon as it becomes successful, what happens is that the scientists are kicked out of their management roles, okay? And the management says, we don't, you scientists, you just give us innovation, right? Keep cranking out the patents, and what we'll do is we'll create the world's first big entrant into the biotech market by creating economies of scale. We'll use New York finance, and we'll make the scientists into workers, and that's what they do. So Amgen is, by the way, still one of the world's biggest biotech firms. It's in Southern California. Boyer says, I don't like that, okay? That's not, well, it kind of just doesn't feel comfortable. And Boyer teams up with a young entrepreneur named Robert Swanson, I think. I'm forgetting from the book. And Swanson comes from the IT world, from Silicon Valley. And he says, you know what? I can work with you because I know how to make entrepreneurial firms work. And we can make the scientists and the managers be comfortable together. And so they create a new form of firm that is essentially managed by the scientists and the professional managers, and it's called Genentech. The Genentech model is rapidly imitated in the Bay Area because Boyer actively encourages his people to spin off other firms. He's not afraid of competition, and indeed, he himself goes onto several boards of directors with former collaborators, and Swanson keeps pulling in managers that are coming directly out of the IT world into the biotech world, saying, we know how to do this kind of like young firm thing. The Bay Area has no big hit in biotech like Amgen, but it has many biotech firms. So the result, of course, is that you get created in the Bay Area, in biotech, something like a second version of the IT economy, meaning networked, highly flexible, people forming invisible colleges and so on. So what you have today is a big biotech cluster in the Bay Area and one big firm in LA. And all the statistics that go along with that are very clear. So where do we get with this? Southern California was not, in my opinion, doomed to failure. Failure is a strong word in any case. It's a big economy. It's not a poor economy. But as bad luck would have it, there was really nobody in Hollywood or aerospace or more recently the life science community in Southern California that crossed boundaries and broke mentalities or transposed skills from old economy ways of doing things to new economy ways, and no one who could convince the elite business leadership of Southern California that there was a thing called the new economy and that old corporate practices weren't really gonna make it anymore. There were lots of structural barriers, so that's again fragmented relations, mentalities that blocked, that in combination with the non-existence of a Steve Jobs or any of those other robust actors, made this not happen. Now, it's also, you could think of a counterfactual that maybe someone could have blocked these things at any time they were happening in the Bay Area, and I think that's possible. I don't think you can tell a story about economic development by looking backward and say it had to be, it was destiny. Along the way, we have human actors, we have organizations, and someone, by the way, Fred Terman, another anecdote, Fred Terman, who's the famous dean of Stanford, who started up the Stanford Research, whatever it's called, park, he only succeeded on his third try. The first two were in Southern California. He thought in 1946, when he started, that LA would be a much better place to have this, and he got blocked. He got blocked twice, and then he said, I'll go north. So this is kind of like a detective story. It has a lot of loose ends. There's no silver bullet when you try to explain the development of large regions. But I would say that if you go back to the starting point, when you examine the standard explanations, the kind of factor endowments and the external shocks and all that, that you really don't get a satisfactory explanation. And it's only and when you clean those out statistically, that when you start to examine the actual pathways of how organizations and networks of people and mentalities evolve, that you get somewhat closer to what I would call the central purpose of, or a central target of economic development analysis, which is to actually see the process of change as it unfolds in a non-deterministic way over time and space. So, and the other, I think another big lesson is that what works in one period doesn't necessarily work in another. Greater Los Angeles was the economic star of the Western world from 1920 to 1970. It was a region that added millions of people and went right up the ranks of per capita income of world regions, right? And it had organizational and technological innovations in one industry after another that made it sort of like what San Francisco has become more recently. And the point is that these things don't last forever. So that's a kind of a cautionary tale for the future. So that's a story that we tell in a great deal more detail in the book. And sorry I went on so long, and I'll be happy to have a debate and questions with all of you.
So, well, I really buy a lot of your arguments. I think it's really interesting. I have two things I'd like to raise. One is I think it's so interesting how this key period of the 70s and 80s is really the divergence point. And I would say that you really do underemphasize the incredible role of the Department of Defense in Silicon Valley as a major funder of research in that period of time. Remember that Lockheed Martin, Erica Schoenberger wrote this piece that showed how Lockheed Martin put their whole missiles and space and communications division in Silicon Valley very early on in the 1970s to separate it from the building of airplanes, et cetera. And that was the key, one of the key innovation sectors. So not only is it huge amounts of ongoing research money, which is still true today, huge. I mean, we have an $800 billion defense budget, and a lot of it goes to Silicon Valley. But it was also the Department of Defense was the major market in early years, in exactly that time, for the products of the IT industry and their role in everything, internet and everything else. And I just think that deserves to be part of your story. The other thing I was puzzled by is because I love the occupational analysis. I found the same thing when I looked at the sectoral composition in Northern and Southern California, the occupational compensation sectors. I didn't understand why you did your per capita income research by just looking at college graduates in the two regions, because if you'd broken it down occupationally, I think you would have, again, seen a really big difference between the kinds of the occupational composition, or maybe you did do that, of people with higher educational attainment in the North and South. So I wasn't really clear about that part.
Okay, so on the latter question, the statistics, actually we did do, I just kind of skimmed over all that stuff really rapidly, but we decomposed the data on occupations, wages, industries, educational background, immigrant status, age, gender, and any way that you take those data, at least at any way that you can drill down to the most specific levels, what you find is that Bay Area wages are higher within every one of those categories. Okay, so I think we found that. Going back to the Defense Department, the kind of military procurement side of all of this, of course there's the story about Litton and Lockheed Martin in the Bay Area, but it seemed to us actually that that actually militates in favor of actually a de-emphasis somewhat of the role of military procurement in the Bay Area for two reasons. So the defense companies in Southern California made more semiconductors in 1970 than the Bay Area. And the reason they did is because they were making them as chips that would be used for guiding the missiles, right, and tracking the missiles insofar as one could do it. So you had this kind of luxury chip market in Southern California. And the decisive thing that happened in Northern California was that they didn't have enough funding from the Defense Department to support the emerging chip industry. So Fairchild and HP couldn't get enough of that market. It was sucked up by the Southern California defense companies so much that they decided, there's a specific moment where there's a report that we have referenced in the book where they decide that they're going to try to go commercial. And then Fairchild breaks through with a cheaper chip. And that's where there's the kind of parting of the waters. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that somewhere in the background, some of the Valley's technological capabilities come from defense, from the sort of general infusion of Defense Department money. But the specific thing that happens was that the Bay Area decides we're not just going to build chips for missiles and Pentagon products. The other thing to remember is that HP was started in 1938. Right? And they were tinkering around, and they weren't a particularly defense-oriented company, nor was Fairchild. So that's how we, okay.
Hi. My name is Bharat Punjabi, Monk School of Global Affairs. I had a question for you on, as you were narrating the story on Los Angeles and San Francisco, I was thinking of two cities in southern India, Bangalore and Hyderabad, which have been competing with each other for investment in the IT sector. So my first question to you is, what could we learn from this study in terms of the comparative methodology which we could apply to developing countries? And you've been writing on urbanism in the global south. And my second question to you is, as one of the leading economic geographers, I've followed your work for a long time, and I always identified your work as being in the kind of Weberian framework. And so what I saw today was a lot more complex and eclectic and also more institutional and Veblen-esque. So if you could kind of say something on that.
That's a hard question, two hard questions. I actually haven't thought about how this study might be applied to developing country situations. I mean, my instinct, for example, is that there are probably some hints in this work that could be applied. For example, I mean, the developing country that I know the best would be Brazil. So if you take the three metropolitan areas of Brazil, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Belo Horizonte, you know, certainly, I mean, there's got to be differences in specialization patterns, agglomeration economies, networks, the whole sort of, you know, tissue of innovators that probably are driving them down different pathways. So my guess is that you could do something with that in carefully paired comparisons within other countries, whether they be developed or developing. I can't tell you specifically how it would work out. It seems to me there's probably stuff to do there.
It relates to one of the last slides, right, where he says there's no silver bullet, right?
Right.
You'll have to do the analysis very specifically for the regional, the historical, and the environmental
That's right.
reasons.
Yeah. Oh, on theory and being eclectic and all that sort of thing. I've always been eclectic, personally. You know, I mean, but one thing we did in this book, which I think for me was a first, is that we started from the standpoint of more conventional urban and regional economics. And we said they have the most structured, elegant hypotheses in thinking about divergent development. A lot of it you have to borrow actually from international development theory, but you can also get it from contemporary urban and regional economics. And that's why in the first part of this book, the first several chapters are almost entirely statistical. And what we tried to do is we tried to see if we could find in those explanations a satisfactory explanation of why two metropolitan areas would have such a sharp divergence. And it's only after we found gaps in those that we turned to reconstructing the history of the different industries. And once we did that, we then said we've got hints in how these industries diverge that we're now going to see if they are systematically visible with statistical evidence about the two regions, about their institutions, networks, practices, and beliefs. So that was sort of how the thing, why I said it unfolded as a bit of a detective story, with the idea of giving, as it were, a chance to almost every possible type of explanation you could derive from the extant literatures. And why I think, without wanting to push the advantages of the book too much, that it's interesting both as a story about California, but that it also has something to say about the field of what you need to do to explain divergent economic development between places more generally, because it engages with a wide variety of hypotheses that are out there in the field, and sort of, but does it in a really, I think, with a real deep dive into the data on each one of these hypotheses.
So, Michael, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for your perseverance and staying and delivering what was an enormously stimulating and thought-provoking lecture, well worth waiting for. I've got a dozen questions, but I will, in the interest of time in your schedule, I'll try to boil them down to a couple of concise ones. And they focus around the innovation piece and the civic networks piece. So someone who writes a lot about Silicon Valley, who I've followed for many years, Doug Henton, has an argument, right, which I think he makes actually now in Scott's book, Global City Regions from 2001. But his argument is about the innovation patterns in Silicon Valley. And one of the, which you sort of touched on at one point, but then it sort of disappears from the story. And I want to know whether you go into it in any more depth. But one of the things that Henton has argued for a long time is one of the great secrets or strengths in Silicon Valley has been the ability of the firms to reinvent themselves through successive waves of technology and technological change. So if you look at the firms driving the Silicon Valley economy today, and especially with the current migration from the Valley into San Francisco, very different from the firms that spun out of Fairchild Semiconductor in the 70s and even into the 80s, or the next generation that came out of Berkeley in the 80s. So where does that innovation piece of the story seem to me to get lost as you moved into the network? So that's the first part. But the other piece that I thought you elided over a little too easily was the link between the business networks and the civic networks. You said they were both present in the Valley to a much greater extent. They were both important, but you didn't, and it almost implies a causal relationship between them, but is it just correlation? They both happen to be more effectively networked. Do the stronger business networks among Valley firms contribute to the resilience of the civic networks that you've found evidence of? In the Sean Safford story, which you made reference to, it's all about the social networks, right? Which serve to reinvigorate the business networks in Allenstown and never, and get ossified in Youngstown. So I'm just curious about where and how you see that part of the story.
Big questions again. So start with the first, which is about the Valley's many waves of innovation. Yeah, I absolutely think that's central. I mean, the phrase in Silicon Valley now is it's Silicon Valley 7.0, right? That's the 7 different phases. And so obviously, that comes from an innovation ecology that's not yet done. It hasn't yet exhausted itself or become fossilized or whatever, which, if economic history is any guide, that is, in fact, what the Bay Area will have to look out for one day. This is something I always say in talks in the Bay Area is you're a bit too overconfident right now. Nothing lasts forever in economic development. Remember, if you were to look at 1960 and go and talk to civic leaders in Detroit and tell them that one day they might ever have a problem, they would have laughed at you. It was one of the richest and most vibrant regional economies in North America. So again, but still, something about the system that was created in the 70s and 80s is still working in the Bay Area. You're right, you mentioned the app developers in San Francisco. What's really interesting about it is that Silicon Valley isn't just in Silicon Valley anymore. The entire Bay Area is basically Silicon Valley now. It has the densest concentration in the Valley itself. But San Francisco, the East Bay, I just have a PhD student just finished his dissertation on the regionalization of IT and all of the subclusters. And that's reflected in the networks. So the civic and leadership networks in the Bay Area are all tied together through one single organization, which is the Bay Area Council. They all support the Bay Area Council Economic Forum. They go to the meetings. And so what you have is the Bay Area Council was originally in San Francisco, but it managed to remain a regional organization by incorporating the Silicon Valley leadership and also to saying intelligent things. In Southern California, you have competing business leadership organizations. And to give you an example, we have a big high-tech economy in a county that is adjacent to Los Angeles County. It's called Orange County. And the capital city of Orange County is Irvine. And we went and interviewed the mayor of Irvine, and he said, you can quote me on this. He said, like, why don't you become a member of the Los Angeles Business Roundtable? And he said, oh, because Los Angeles is the big dog, and we don't want to be eaten by the big dog. Nobody in San Jose said that to us. So there's an indication of networks and cooperation and sort of how things, as it were, tie together or don't tie together. So again, you're right about the many waves of innovation. That's ongoing. And now one thing I can't tell you about is this causality stuff is really hard to tease out. But I do think that but here's where I would take a good guess at it. The original network crossing was when the technologists and the other elements of the Bay Area scientific and civic cultures came together. And they came together in places like Xerox PARC, where, as it were, the appropriate technology people and the old-fashioned technology people found themselves working alongside one another and infusing each other with different skills and making knowledge transfer from one network to another. And to that was added a multiplication of the actual places they would come together to talk. So Berkeley and Stanford have a lot more linkages than Caltech, UCLA, USC, and Irvine do. They just talk to each other more. The Bay Area Council brings them all together in a very inclusive way. You have lots of informal gathering points, mostly because of a more politically liberal elite in the Bay Area, where the engineers aren't quite as hostile to sort of new ways of life ideas than in Southern California, where the engineering community, being Pentagon-oriented, was more politically conservative and absolutely uncooperative for reasons of secrecy, but also for reasons of social rejection with any of the more progressive elements in Southern California. So all of this comes together into a theme, which is who talks to whom, but not only because talking is just good in and of itself, but because what people, again, like the economic sociologists tell us is when people talk and meet, skills and ideas flow. And the important thing was, how do skills and ideas flow from old economy knowledge to absorb new economy ideas, and notably to accept the organizational practices and forms that you need to have a new economy. In LA, it had a fabulous old economy, but they never got the ideas about how the world was changing, and they missed it.
No, hold on.
You seem to be hinting at competition between Silicon Valley and Hollywood. I don't think so. But this is really, to be blunt about it, irrelevant in 1970. I mean, it's the beginning of, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Patricia McCartney. I'm the director of the Global Cities Institute here at the University of Toronto. And I just want to thank you for this wonderful talk. It was fantastic. And I loved what you had to say about all of this. And I'm trying to take it, I work with data and helping data get into city leadership offices, mayors and city innovation officers, et cetera, and how what you've done can now travel into a mayor's office or a chief information officer, and because I think there's tremendous kernels of knowledge that really could drive change in City Hall to help us here in Toronto, for example, because I think we have, for example, we aggregated data for 23 municipalities around the Toronto urban region, working with 23, and it turned out our higher ed degrees in this area were about on par with the San Francisco Bay Area, way above Chicago, way above others. But what do we do with that? Because as you started, I was fascinated in the beginning of the talk because you started out, well, it's not just higher ed degrees, but it's about these other things. And then I heard you talking about how the San Francisco Bay Area actually coined the, we're into the new economy. So my question then is, well, what is Toronto into? What is our Toronto urban region into? How do we tag ourselves? And then you talked about the networks. So there's another kernel of how networks can cross between our universities, which I was listening to you saying how the Berkeley and Stanford talk to each other. Well, we talk a little bit across York and Ryerson and Kitchener-Waterloo, not a whole lot. And then we have networks of leaders that don't talk to each other too much because of the big dog syndrome that you just talked about with. So I was thinking, like, if you had to instruct or give through your School of Public Affairs, how this would travel to a policy advocacy platform for city leadership, because I think what you might tell Menlo Park is something that you might also have a discussion with here. And it's really fascinating if you've started to think about how those kernels can start to drive an agenda within cities themselves and around public policy and public leadership. Sorry, that's a
Told you it's going to happen.
Well, okay, so I could just say reply quickly by sort of way of advertising. So we have one chapter in the book where we talk about data issues and methodology. And we talk about how the field of development studies, and especially urban and regional development studies, could be improved. And we do that because this really deep dive into two areas showed us what kinds of data are available, lots of kinds of data that are deficient and missing. And so we sort of come together with a methodological statement about data comparability, the new kinds of data that we need to get this kind of deep microscopic understanding of regions. And to go from a two-city comparison to a larger sample would require these kinds of data assembly efforts that right now block the field from having greater depth. So that's sort of on the first part of your comment. The second part of this sort of what to do thing is we have a chapter about what we call sort of alternative conversations, meaning who should have talked and what should they have talked about at different times in these regions' evolution. And it's not that talk is everything, but it's kind of used as a metaphor for this issue of institutions, analyses or representations or beliefs about the world, bringing together skills across relational, sort of different relational networks, and thinking about that as what any economy, it could be a region, it could be any other scale, needs to do in order to transition from one period of economic development to another. And so we try to imagine what it would have looked like if, say, Southern California had thought about itself differently, if its leaders had been constructing different kinds of networks, and what might have happened out of that. And likewise, you can think about what could have gone wrong in the Bay Area. A lot of things could have gone wrong. And indeed, some things did go wrong. It wasn't all perfect. So there's some stuff like that. Okay, but to be perfectly honest, I'm an academic. I've talked to some people in the mayor's office of LA, and we have a very good mayor who's very open, but it's not exactly the kind of policy formula that people like. Oh yeah, you told me to have a different conversation and build social networks. So it's a hard sell, to be honest. My job as an academic is to create the hard sell, but implementing it is with all due respect for the people in the trenches, it's hard.
Yeah.
Idea of getting people together, talking really important, those brushing up against each other. Not a lot about this, Jane Jacobs. One is a complex, dense. The other is a sprawling, open, suburban kind of community. Behind cities, that's where people actually talk to each other. Other differences aren't in that position where they and run into each people and talk to each other all the time. How that plays into that. The networks is going to happen a lot better in cities. Last thing you want to do is try and engage these low-density, sprawling communities. Actually have the creative happen. That will only wreck the creative thing. That explains a lot of the differences.
So let me play a bit of agent provocateur on that one. I mean, by the way, and I completely agree with you about the role of central cities in today's economy in the 21st century. I think it is growing. I think it is essential, and especially in certain areas of the economy. So we're, I think, completely in agreement with you, sir. But if you look at these two regions, let me throw out a few things that might surprise people. That the average density of greater Southern California is higher than that of the San Francisco Bay Area and higher than that of the New York metropolitan region. So LA is an optical illusion. It has a weak center, but it has the highest average density in the United States of any metropolitan region. Moreover, even though LA has a weak downtown core, but it has areas that are as dense as this urban core of San Francisco. For example, West Hollywood is a city whose density is slightly higher than that of the city of San Francisco. So now, the other thing I think to throw into this mix is the paradox that Silicon Valley isn't San Francisco. It's an hour and 10 minutes south by car from San Francisco, and it is a sprawling, low-density, typical California suburb. And it looks exactly like Orange County and most of LA. So we have a case here. Now, I'm not in any way negating your hypotheses about Jane Jacobs type interactions. Now, there's something that's a little more complex going on because I'm talking about region-wide, not just Central City. So, now there may be, however, a way in which this goes in the sense of your comment, which is that even though Silicon Valley emerges in this sprawling new suburb, the way that it was, in a way, networked by the old Central City elite, that's where the tie-in might happen. That there was no downtown Los Angeles elite to sort of say, look, we've got all this technology out there in the region, and you people really all need to come together and talk to one another, even if you're out there in sort of the sprawl. And I do think that there's probably a link there, which I haven't been able to test in any formal way. But again, we're talking about, I think, Jane Jacobs was talking about dense central city areas, and we need to figure out what that means for extended metropolitan regions, which by definition have vast areas of sprawl. And somehow, whether the networks that exist in central cities somehow have this way of tying together the new sprawl, not physically, but organizationally, in ways that are sort of like invisible. And just again, but the last thing is, LA isn't as sprawling as everyone thinks it is. Yeah, but again, I think it's a really interesting, set of questions we need to move deeper on. In general, I think you're right. And there, of course, you do, by the way, find, I think we did, I didn't get to talk about it, but the Bay Area has had much more consistent progressive political majorities than LA. And that probably did have an effect on its more consensual kind of networking, whereas LA was a more conflictual place because of sharp political cleavages.
Okay, we'll take the last question, please.
Well, hello. This sort of fits into a theory I have had for a long time, that economic success of most places depends on the mentality of its economic elite. So I'm wondering if you have any, could go a little further with this idea that, I'll put it this way. How would a city like Toronto, what would it have to do to get an economic elite who has its head screwed on the right way and can produce these good things? I think that needs to be gone into a little more.
I mean, I would say that it's sort of, in a way, our job, maybe it's the job of us, the community of researchers, if we believe this, to come up with more and more evidence that this is, in a sense, something that really pays off as an investment of the elite's time. Because I think it's a legitimate case that elites, I mean, I've interviewed lots of people in the business world, and they have a legitimate response, which is, I'm a very busy person. Tell me why I should spend time networking and talking to other people, whether it's really going to be good both for my business but also for my community. And I think that we are starting to accumulate evidence that some of these network structures really make a difference, and that the institutional forms, the kind of wider set of institutional forms, make a difference. But it's been a long time coming. So that's, in part, the role that we have in the research business.
Thank you very much, Michael, especially considering the harsh environment where we made you speak. We appreciate it, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.